There's gathering momentum for a new development along the Fairmount Indigo corridor with the recent increase in service along with plans for more growth. The rail line is encouraging transit-oriented housing and jobs to maximize the potential for new housing. Our guest has recently co-authored a proposal in Commonwealth magazine for new incentives. We'd like to welcome Conor Ahern. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You worked on this with former City Councilor Larry Carabet, but even before that, this started as a contest, I guess.
Yeah, so I took a class on local government law when I was a 2L. I'm a law student at Harvard University, and I found it fascinating. I think lots of times we tend to think, maybe I'm speaking only for law students, but we tend to think of the hierarchy as federal being most important, and then state, and then local government. And in many ways that is true, but that's not to say that there's not immense potential for taking care of certain policies and achieving certain goals through municipal government. And so we explored those through the class, and then at the end of this class, a classmate of mine sent out a link for a competition that was being put on by the Rappaport Foundation at Suffolk University, where in honor of the new mayor, they were asking any law student or policy student in the state of Massachusetts to submit a proposal for, with the new mayor, how could we reinvigorate a certain area of Boston or accomplish a certain goal that would matter to us as young people or as students or as people interested in civil government. And so I put together a proposal that advocated a different type of taxation scheme.
Well, this line goes all the way from Reedville to Newmarket Square, and for many years it was like a lot of other rail lines. You didn't want to live near it, so not much development went on. What's happened since then?
Well, I think what we've seen is Boston has had a huge reinvigoration and interest in its housing. Like many other cities around the country, young people are drawn to it, Boston especially because of its being known as a place with lots of students, lots of freshness and ideas and startup culture. And I think that Boston has a finite envelope on which to build. We have the river and we have the ocean, and on the other end we have the city boundaries. And so there's only so much land on which you can build. We've also had, we talk about this in the article, there's been a lot of downzoning, not recently, but it's still in place. And so that limits the height of buildings, for example, or the amount of families that can live in those buildings. All of this keeps the population artificially low. It keeps property values artificially low. And so people end up finding areas where they would want to go in place of the places that have been downsized, for instance. And so what we see on the Indigo line is the potential where we have, in a otherwise very expensive city, we have the potential to build an area that is residentially, commercially robust, and already has the infrastructure in terms of a line there. What the article proposed is that we could change perhaps the nature of that line, maybe make it more light rail-like, and also add in both tax policy and other types of policies to incentivize those who are holding this land and hoping for it to appreciate, but not really contributing to the community or making it a more attractive place to live, to sell off those properties. And in its place, we would assume that, depending on the policies and how well they were executed, residential areas and commercial areas would crop up around the line, which is, of course, the case in not only Boston, but pretty much every other city in the country where you have public transportation. People are going to go there.
Well, we've seen this progression already in the last few years, that there has been some higher density housing built near stations along this line. First by CDCs, the nonprofit developers, and City recently got 3 proposals for a part of the line where there isn't even a station yet. So I guess there's appetite for this.
There is, and I think that we would only, both Larry and I would only want to encourage more of that. This is a type of, in the article we talk about how we could specifically incentivize builders to reserve certain portions of their buildings for lower income individuals. Boston, although it does have increasing density, we also have a problem where, because it's so expensive, it's very difficult for people to live within the city. Another major trend in urban demographics is, formerly it was the poor who lived in the cities, and now the poor are being forced out into the suburbs. And so it really lowers quality of life to have to rely on types of transportation like buses that are not right near one's house. And so to allow poor people to live still within the city for reasonable amounts would be something we would want to encourage along this area. We also wouldn't want to encourage flight of the people who currently live there. We don't want to ensure that the composition of the neighborhood would change. More so than, of course, it would just by dint of being more enlivened and a more economically and demographically robust area.
Well, in a sense, you're trying to do what many cities have been doing for decades under that disreputable name of urban renewal. You try to incentivize development where it's been lagging before. So how is your idea different from that?
Well, so the idea is different because Boston is lucky enough to have a system in place where the city already assesses on a fairly periodic basis, I think it might be once every 5 years, that they assess the value of the land and then they assess the value of improvements upon that land. And so as an intuitive matter, you could see where if you allocated the burden of the tax differently in terms of, say, adding a huge amount of tax to fallow or undeveloped land and a small amount, even zero, to the value of the building, you could incentivize individuals to, for instance, build more densely on their land, to eliminate wasteful green areas. Not that that's something we want to eliminate entirely, but we're talking about things like places for employees to eat lunch that don't serve the general public, or we're talking about condos or townhouses that are not particularly tall or large, or the units are very big, for instance. But with a tax system where fallow land is taxed very high and improvements upon that land are taxed at a lower rate, we can incentivize very high density, high value building throughout the city. What that will do is it will encourage, for instance, I think earlier you were talking about speculators, and what speculators hope to gain is just what you're speaking about in terms of the improvement in the area, and eventually they get to a point where the land that they've held on to appreciates so much in value that they've recouped their investment. But in the meanwhile, that area of land is not benefiting the community. It's not really benefiting anyone except for the future speculator. And what we would do with that policy is say, from the very beginning, we would have a taxation scheme that would incentivize that person to not hold on to that land, to give it up early so that it could develop organically, and the increases in value that would come from that would-be speculated land would go to the community members that would actually help build that community.
Now, this might have to be a city-wide change of law. So, once you're outside this corridor, is there a danger that there might be people who are, they own some land, they're not doing anything with it, but maybe they're just in some ways incapacitated? Who knows? I mean, should that be penalized the same way?
It's tough to say. I hadn't considered that, and I think that with any policy that you apply broadly to an entire city, you're going to get some negative aspects. Some people will suffer in ways that a speculator. We're expecting speculators to suffer, meaning that they won't get to speculate and that the communities will reap the benefits that they would hope to gain. Unfortunately, there would be some negative aspects, such as the individual who is maybe incapacitated and would otherwise do something different with this land. Luckily, the nature of cities is such that it's unlikely that an individual who's just holding on to a property for that reason, especially in such a high value, low availability of housing and land place like Boston, that would probably be fairly rare, and certainly would be far lower of a proportion, almost a minuscule proportion, compared to the number of speculators who would be kind of disgorged by virtue of this tax policy.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Conor Ahern will have more news in just a moment.